Hello and welcome to Rich Rides. This week I'm doing a long-term review of one of my own bikes. This is a Honda XR150. So as I said, this is my own bike. It's a 2017 model of the XR150. As the name suggests, it's part of the XR range, which is Honda's sort of street legal, sort of off-road type bike. They do various cc's, and the 150 is the smallest, so it's 150cc single cylinder. I've owned this for just over a year now, so I thought it was worth doing a review, a sort of long-term review on what it's like to live with as a bike. So this bike's fairly standard. The only change is the exhaust, really. So I had a Kropovich copy, I'm assuming from the cost, a rear silencer put on it with a different downpipe, so it sounds a lot nicer. So first of all, let's talk about the sort of boring practical stuff. So switchgear is pretty much as you'd expect. You've just got over on your left your lights, indicators and horn, that's about it. Obviously a clutch, and then over on your right you've literally just got a starter, your front brake and your throttle. The mirrors on this bike, I don't think they're the standard ones. I think the standard ones are round. These do a really good job actually. The bars are fairly wide, fairly flat and fairly wide. You don't see lots of elbow, you get like good visibility, and because it's higher than sort of road bikes and scooters and things, then you get a really good view as well. Comfort wise, as you can see, my knees fit around the tank quite nicely. I'm 6 foot tall and the bike feels slightly small. The 150 version of the XR, there is actually a 125 version, thinking about it, that's slightly smaller, sort of frame wise and stuff. But I think the 150 and the 250 share the same frame. So they're physically not a large bike, but the sort of bigger XRs like the 400s are physically larger than this. So it's okay around town. My knees are fairly bent, so on a long trip, and especially if you've done some off-road, you can feel it in your knees. The pegs are just slightly forward of your hips, but that's really good off-road because you can stand up on the pegs quite nicely and your position's pretty good for being stood up, which obviously as a dirt bike you want. The engine is your typical 150cc Honda lump, so it's a 4-stroke single cylinder, about 12 horsepower. So that exhaust makes it sound a lot better than it should do. Get the sort of pops and crackles on overrun as well. But for what it is in the engine size, it's pretty good really. The gearbox is a 5-speed, so its ratios are pretty good. First's pretty low, but it's pretty good for off-road. 5th gear is probably slightly low, so when you're cruising at sort of higher speeds, then it's not silent, it's revving quite a bit. But for the style of bike, then it's absolutely fine. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the switchgear, there's not really many toys, it's all fairly basic. So your dash, all you've got is a analog speedo, trip meter, which is a good old analog one as well, where you have to rotate it back to 0, and then warning lights. You've literally got indicator, main beam and a neutral light, so there's no sort of gear indicator, and there's no fuel gauge, which is a bit annoying on a modern bike. But yeah, that's it as far as toys are concerned. There's nothing really. And other things, then the only other thing really, I guess, is that it's got a rear rack as standard, and that's actually really useful. So the standard rear rack, you can just strap your bags straight to it. It's got plenty of sort of take-off points for bungee straps and stuff and rope, or you can do like I've done and fit a top box. So the beauty of that is touring and stuff, everything stays dry in your top box. You can carry everything because there's obviously not much other storage. Your only other slight storage, again, it's handy to have, is it has a little toolbox that you can get to without taking the side panels off or anything, but that's sort of tucked under the rear fender. So yes, it gets hit with mud and that kind of thing, but if you need screwdrivers, those kinds of things, then you can access all that nice and easily. So we talked about the engine earlier. For places like this, then this sort of power's fine. I'm currently in Vietnam. You really don't want a big capacity fast bike here. There's so much traffic on the roads. This is a quiet Saturday afternoon here, so there's not much traffic about, and as you can see, it's just scooters, but anything can come out of any side road at any point, so there's no point having 100, 150 horsepower on a bike here. So one of the advantages of a sort of small capacity bike like that is your sort of fuel consumption is very low. So you'll get 100 miles to the gallon, and from memory I think it's got a 12 litre tank, something like that, so you get between 400 and 500 kilometres to a tank of fuel, and that's actually really good if you're doing any touring stuff, because there's some roads, especially out here, where you can go for a long way without seeing a fuel station, so that obviously helps if you're going to do any long distance stuff. So talking of long distance, then comfort. So comfort wise, the seats, it's better than most sort of dirt bikes, but it's still not the most comfortable thing in the world. Could do with a bit more padding. So I tend to stop between 1 and 2 hours riding, because your bum's sort of had enough by that point and you need to just get off and move around a bit. As I mentioned before, because I'm quite tall, then your legs are quite bent, so you can feel quite cramped after a while. But you can actually move around quite a bit on the seat, and it does have a little raised area at the back for pillion. So as a pillion bike, it's got pillion pegs as well, of course, then it's not too bad. My son comes on it quite a bit, and he fits easily and nicely on it. So the other thing with comfort is obviously the suspension. So it's got quite a lot of front wheel travel on the forks, so it does soak up bumps well. Rear does, it's slightly harder than you'd think sometimes. Most stuff it's absolutely fine, but interestingly, as it is a off-road focused bike, then on road you can sort of hit its handling limits fairly soon, and the suspension does sort of show itself up a bit once you're sort of pushing it at those limits of 150cc, of course, but on like decent tarmac roads up in the mountains, straight through a red light, nice. Yeah, on those fast roads where you're doing sort of 100k's, that kind of thing, you start hitting corners there and it's a bit different. You get a bit of back end bounce and the front can wash out a bit, but it's not an expensive bike. So that leads nicely on to sort of costs of it. As I mentioned before, the running costs themselves are pretty low because it's 100 miles per gallon. It's a Honda, parts are really cheap for it and you can get hold of them easily. So your running costs are pretty good. Even to buy one brand new over here in Vietnam, they're actually imported. But you can buy them brand new for about 2,000 UK pounds. So it's a cheap bike really. But for a cheap bike, it doesn't feel too cheaply made. It's pretty good. So what's it like around town? I find it to be really good. The combination of it being light and it's incredibly nimble, so you can get around traffic, and in town when it's really busy then you don't really have any issues. It's also got the power when you need it, if you need to get past someone. So yeah, as a town bike, normally a dirt bike would be a bit of a pain and a handful, but this, it's not too tall. It's light on its feet or on its tyres, so you can get around quite easily. So something I've not talked about are the brakes. So it's a front disc, not huge, and only single disc, and a rear drum. The rear is actually really good. I use that mainly around town as the main brake. The front is decent, and it's certainly adequate for the sort of size of bike. The only thing I find is at low speed it can be a bit grabby. There's not a lot of progression between off and on, but you sort of get used to it. Like I say, around town you sometimes notice it at low speed. At higher speeds then it's fine when you really want to scrub some speed off, but at sort of very low speed then it can be a bit grabby, but that's it really. So on to my usual positives and negatives. So on the positive side, I think in summary it's just a really good all-round bike, especially for a place like here, where it's one of those bikes that just does absolutely everything. It does everything really well. It doesn't totally excel at absolutely everything. As I mentioned before, sort of its on-road manners are sort of compromised a bit when pushed, and off-road it's pretty good, but if you pitch it against something that is purely off-road focused, then yes, it will struggle a little bit. So like I say, it does everything really well. It's a, if you have to have one bike, then it's a brilliant bike. So the second thing I like is, as an introduction to either riding manual motorbikes or your first off-road bike, then I think it's perfect. I think that combo of it being so easy to ride, the clutch is really light and controllable, the brakes are decent, just everything about it. It's not overpowered, so you're not going to get whiskey throttle. So just as a intro to riding or riding off-road, it's brilliant. Then any negatives, the only two really are having no fuel gauge is a bit annoying, and then as I mentioned before, just that slightly grabby front brake. But that's it really. It's a superb all-rounder. So yeah, I hope you found that useful. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like. If you've got any questions, then do just comment and ask away. Like I say, I've owned the bike a year, so I know the bike pretty well. Done a lot of big trips on it. So thanks again for watching, and see you again next time.